It was for his union's Washington Lincoln birthday fundraiser, his first February out in Chicago, that somebody got the idea to turn Ira, a wiry man, knobbly jointed with dark, coarse Indian-like hair and a floppy, big-footed gait, into Abe Lincoln. Put whiskers on him, decked him out in a stovepipe hat, high-button shoes, and an old-fashioned, ill-fitting black suit, and sent him up to the lectern to read from the Lincoln-Douglas debates one of Lincoln's most telling condemnations of slavery. He got such a big hand for giving the word slavery a strong, working-class political slant and enjoyed himself so much doing it that he continued right on with the only thing he remembered by heart from his 9.5 years of schooling, the Gettysburg Address. He brought the house down with the finale. That sentence, as gloriously resolute as any sounded in heaven or uttered on earth since the world began. Raising and wiggling one of those huge, hairy-knuckled, super-flexible hands of his, plunging the longest of his inordinately long fingers right into the eyeball of his Union audience, each of the 3 times he dramatically dropped his voice and rasped, "The people." Everybody thought I got carried away by emotion, Ira told me. That's what fired me up. But it wasn't emotions. It was the first time I ever felt carried away by intellect. I understood for the first time in my life what the hell I was talking about. I understood what this country is all about. After that night, on his weekends, on holidays, he traveled the Chicago area for the CIO, as far as Galesburg and Springfield out to authentic Lincoln country, portraying Abraham Lincoln for CIO conventions, cultural programs, parades, and picnics. He went on the UE radio show where even if nobody could see him standing 2 inches taller even than Lincoln, he did a bang-up job bringing Lincoln to the masses by speaking every word so that it made good, plain sense. People began to take their kids along when Ira Ringgold was to appear on the platform, and afterward, when whole families came up to shake his hand, the kids would ask to sit on his knee and tell him what they wanted for Christmas. Not so strangely, the unions he performed for were by and large locals that either broke with the CIO or were expelled when CIO President Philip Murray began in 1947 to rid member unions of communist leadership and communist membership. But by 1948, Ira was a rising radio star in New York, newly married to one of the country's most revered radio actresses, and for the moment safely protected from the crusade that would annihilate forever, and not only from the labor movement, a pro-Soviet, pro-Stalin political presence in America. How did he get from the record factory to a network drama show? Why did he leave Chicago and O'Day in the first place? It could never have occurred to me at that time that it had anything to do with the Communist Party, mainly because I never knew back then that he was a member of the Communist Party. What I understood was that the radio writer Arthur Sokolow, visiting Chicago, happened to catch Ira's Lincoln act in a Union Hall on the West Side one night. Ira had already met Sokolow in the Army. He'd come to Iran as a GI with the This Is the Army show. A lot of left-wing guys were touring with the show, and late one evening, Ira had gone off with a few of them for a bull session during which, as Ira remembered it, they discussed all the political stuff in the world. Among the group was Sokolow, whom Ira came quickly to admire as someone who was always battling for a cause. Because Sokolow had begun life in Detroit as a Jewish street kid fighting off the Poles, he was also completely recognizable, and Ira felt at once a kinship he'd never wholly had with the rootless Irishman O'Day. By the time Sokolow, now a civilian writing The Free and the Brave, happened to turn up in Chicago, Ira was on stage for a full hour as Lincoln, not only reciting or reading from speeches and documents, but responding to audience questions about current political controversies in the guise of Abraham Lincoln, with Lincoln's high-pitched country twang and his awkward giant gestures and his droll, plain-spoken way. Lincoln supporting price controls. Lincoln condemning the Smith Act. Lincoln defending workers' rights. Lincoln vilifying Mississippi's Senator Bilbo. The Union membership loved their stalwart autodidact's irresistible ventriloquism, his mishmash of Ringgoldisms, O'Dayisms, Marxisms, and Lincolnisms. "Pour it on," they shouted at bearded, black-haired Ira. "Give 'em hell, Abe." And so did Sokolow, who brought Ira to the attention of another Jewish ex-GI, a New York soap opera producer with left-leaning sympathies. It was the introduction to the producer that led to the audition that landed Ira the part of the scrappy super of a Brooklyn tenement on one of daytime radio's soap operas. The salary was $55 a week. Not much, even in 1948, but steady work and more money than he made at the record plant. And, almost immediately, he began doing other jobs as well, getting jobs everywhere, jumping into waiting taxis and rushing from studio to studio, from one daytime show to another, as many as 6 different shows a day, always playing characters with working-class roots, tough-talking guys truncated from their politics, as he explained it to me, in order to make their anger permissible. The proletariat, Americanized for the radio by cutting off their balls and their brains. It was all this work that propelled him, within months, onto Sokolow's prestigious weekly hour-long show, The Free and the Brave, as a leading player. Out in the Midwest, there had begun to be physical difficulties for Ira to cope with, and these too furnished a motive for him to try his luck back east in a new line of work. He was plagued by muscle pain, soreness so bad that several times a week, when he didn't have to just endure the pain and go off to play Lincoln or do his missionary work, he'd head right home, soak for half an hour in a tub of steaming water down the hall from his room, and then get into bed with a book, his dictionary, his notepad, and whatever was around to eat. A couple of bad beatings he'd taken in the Army seemed to him the cause of the problem. From the worst of the beatings, he'd been pounced on by a gang from the port who had him down for a nigger lover. He wound up in the hospital for 3 days. They'd begun baiting him when he started to pal around with a couple of Negro soldiers from the segregated unit stationed at the riverfront 3 miles away. O'Day was by then running a group that met at the Quonset Hut Library and under his tutelage discussed politics and books. Barely anybody on the base paid attention to the library or to the 9 or 10 GIs who drifted over there after chow a couple of nights a week to talk about Looking Backward by Bellamy or The Republic by Plato or The Prince by Machiavelli, until the 2 Negroes from the segregated unit joined the group. At first, Ira tried to reason with the men in his outfit who called him nigger lover. Why do you make derogatory remarks about the colored people? All I hear from you guys about the Negro is derogatory remarks, and you aren't only anti-Negro, you're anti-labor, you're anti-liberal, and you're anti-brains. You're anti-every goddamn thing that's in your interest. How can people give their 3 or 4 years to the Army, see friends die, get wounded, have their lives disrupted, and yet not know why it happened and what it's all about? All you know is that Hitler started something. All you know is that the draft board got you. You know what I say? You guys would duplicate the very actions of the Germans if you were in their place. It might take a little longer because of the democratic element in our society, but eventually we would be completely fascist, dictator and all, because of people spouting the shit you guys spout. The discrimination of the top officers who run this port is bad enough, but you people, from poor families, guys without 2 nickels to rub together, guys who are nothing but fodder for the assembly line, for the sweatshop, for the coal mines, who the system pisses on, low wages, high prices, astronomical profits, and you turn out to be a bunch of vociferous, bigoted, red-baiting bastards who don't know. And then he would tell them what they didn't know. Heated discussions that changed nothing, that, because of his temper, Ira admitted, made things only worse. I would lose a good deal of what I wanted to impress them with because in the beginning I was too emotional. Later, I learned how to cool down with these kind of people, and I believe that I impressed a few of them with some facts. But it's very difficult to talk to such men because of the deeply ingrained ideas they have, to explain to them the psychological reasons for segregation, the economic reasons for segregation, the psychological reasons for their use of their beloved word nigger. They are beyond grasping such things. They say nigger because a nigger is a nigger. I'd explain and explain to them, and that's what they'd answer me. I pounded home about education of children and our personal responsibility, and still for all my goddamn explaining, they beat the shit out of me so bad I thought I was going to die. His reputation as a nigger lover turned truly dangerous for Ira when he wrote a letter to Stars and Stripes complaining about the segregated units in the Army and demanding integration. That's when I used my dictionary and Roget's Thesaurus. I would devour those 2 books and try to put them to practical use by writing. Writing a letter for me was like building a scaffold. Probably I would have been criticized by somebody who knew the English language. My grammar was God knows what, but I wrote it anyway because this is what I felt I should do. I was so goddamn angry, see? You understand? I wanted to tell people that this was wrong. After the letter was published, he was working one day up in the loading basket above the hold of the ship when the guys operating the basket threatened to drop him into the hold unless he shut up worrying about niggers. Repeatedly, they dropped him 10, 15, 20 feet, promising next time to let go and break every bone in his body. But, scared as he was, he wouldn't say what they wanted to hear, and in the end, they let him out. Then, the following morning, someone in the mess hall called him a Jew bastard. A nigger-loving Jew bastard. A southern hillbilly with a big mouth, Ira told me. Always made remarks in the mess hall about Jews, about Negroes. This one morning I'm sitting there, near the end of the meal. There weren't that many guys left in the place. And he started to yap off about niggers and Jews. I'm still boiling from the incident the day before on the ship, and so I couldn't take it anymore. And I took off my glasses, and I gave them to a guy I was sitting with, the only guy who'd still sit with me. By then, I'd walk in the mess hall, 200 guys sitting there, and because of my politics, I'd be totally ostracized. Anyway, I went at that son of a bitch. He was a private, and I was a sergeant. From one end of that mess hall to the other, I kicked the shit out of him. Then the first sergeant comes up to me and says, "You want to press charges against this guy? A private attacking a non-commissioned officer?" I quickly said to myself, I'll probably be damned if I do and damned if I don't, right? But from that moment on, nobody ever made an anti-Semitic remark when I was in the vicinity. That didn't mean they'd ever let up about the niggers. Niggers this and niggers that, 100 times a day. This hillbilly tried again with me that same night. We were washing off our mess kits, the stinking little knives they have there. He came at me with that knife. Again, I had him. I put him away, but I didn't do anything more about it. Hours later, Ira got ambushed in the dark and wound up in the hospital. As best he could diagnose the pains that began to develop while he was working at the record factory, they were from the damage caused by that savage beating. Now, he was always pulling a muscle or spraining a joint, his ankle, his wrist, his knee, his neck, and as often as not from doing virtually nothing, no more than stepping off the bus coming home or reaching across the counter for the sugar bowl in the diner where he went to eat. And this is why, however unlikely it seemed that anything would materialize from it, when something was said about a radio audition, Ira leaped at the chance. Maybe there were more machinations than I knew of behind Ira's move to New York and his overnight radio triumph, but I didn't think so back then. I didn't have to. Here was the guy to take my education beyond Norman Corwin, to tell me, for one thing, about the GIs that Corwin didn't talk about, GIs not so nice, or for that matter, so anti-fascist as the heroes of On a Note of Triumph, the GIs who went overseas thinking about niggers and kikes, and who came home thinking about niggers and kikes. Here was an impassioned man, someone rough and scarred by experience, bringing with him first-hand evidence of all the brutish American stuff that Corwin left out. It didn't require communist connections to explain Ira's overnight radio triumph to me. I just thought, this guy is wonderful. He is an Iron Man. That night in '48 at the Henry Wallace rally in Newark, I also met Eve Frame. She was with Ira and with her daughter, Sylphid, the harpist. I saw nothing of what Sylphid felt for her mother, didn't know about their struggle until Murray began to tell me of all that had passed me by as a kid. Everything about Ira's marriage that I didn't or couldn't understand, or that Ira had kept from me during those 2 years when I got to see him every couple of months, either when he came to visit Murray or when I visited him at the cabin, which Ira called his shack, in the hamlet of Zinktown in northwest New Jersey. Ira retreated to Zinktown to live not so much close to nature as close to the bone, to live life in the raw, swimming in the mud pond right into November, tramping the woods on snowshoes in coldest winter, or, on rainy days, meandering around in his Jersey car, a used '39 Chevy Coupe, talking to the local dairy farmers and the old zinc miners, whom he tried to get to understand how they were being screwed by the system. He had a fireplace out there where he liked to cook his hot dogs and beans over the coals, even to brew his coffee, also as to remind himself, after he'd become iron-ridden and a bit enlarded with money and fame, that he was still nothing more than a working stiff, a simple man with simple taste and expectations, who during the '30s had ridden the rails and who got incredibly lucky. About owning the Zinktown shack, he used to say, "Keeps me in practice being poor, just in case." The shack furnished an antidote to West 11th Street and an asylum from West 11th Street, the place where you go to sweat out the bad vapors. It was also a link to the earliest vagabond days, when he was surviving amongst strangers for the first time, and every day was hard and uncertain and, as it would always be for Ira, a battle. After leaving home at 15 and digging ditches for a year in Newark, Ira had taken jobs in the northwesternmost corner of Jersey, sweeping up in various factories, working sometimes as a farmhand, as a watchman, as a handyman, and then, for 2.5 years, until he was nearly 19 and headed west, sucking air in shafts 1,200 feet down in the Sussex zinc mines. After the blasting, with the place still smoking and reeking sickeningly of dynamite, powder, and gas, Ira worked with a pick and a shovel alongside the Mexicans as the lowest of the low, as what they called a mucker. In those years, the Sussex mines were unorganized and as profitable for the New Jersey Zinc Company and as unpleasant for New Jersey zinc workers as zinc mines anywhere in the world. The ore got smelted into metallic zinc down on Passaic Avenue in Newark, and also processed into zinc oxide for paint, and though by the time Ira bought his shack in the late 40s, Jersey Zinc was losing ground to foreign competition, and the mines were already headed for extinction, it was still that first big immersion in brute life. 8 hours underground loading the shattered rock and ore into rail cars, 8 hours of enduring the awful headaches and swallowing the red and brown dust and shitting in the pails of sawdust, and all for 42 cents an hour. That lured him back into the remote Sussex hills. The Zinc Town Shack was the radio actor's openly sentimental expression of solidarity with the dispensable, coarse nobody he'd once been. As he described himself, a brainless human tool, if ever there was one. Another person, having achieved success, might have wanted to abolish those gruesome memories for good, but without the history of his unimportance made somehow tangible, Ira would have felt himself unreal and badly deprived. I hadn't even known that when he came over to Newark, when after I got out of my last class, we took our hikes through Weequahic Park, circling the lake and ending up at our neighborhood's dining simulacrum to Coney Island's Nathan's, a place called Millman's for a hot dog with the works. He wasn't visiting Lehigh Avenue solely to see his brother. On those after-school afternoons, when Ira told me about his years as a soldier and what he learned in Iran, about O'Day and what O'Day taught him about his own recent former life as a factory worker and a union man, and his experiences as a kid shoveling muck in the mines, he was seeking refuge from a household where, from the day he arrived, he found himself unwelcome and unwanted by Sylphid, and more at odds with Eve Frame because of her unforeseen contempt for Jews. Not all Jews, Murray explained. Not the accomplished Jews at the top whom she'd met in Hollywood and on Broadway and in the radio business. Not, by and large, the directors and the actors and the writers and the musicians she worked with, many of whom were regularly to be seen at the salon she made of her West 11th Street house. Her contempt was for the garden variety, the standard-issue Jew she saw shopping in the department stores, for run-of-the-mill people with New York accents, who worked behind counters or who tended their own little shops in Manhattan, for the Jews who drove taxis, for the Jewish families she saw talking and walking together in Central Park. What drove her to distraction on the streets were the Jewish ladies who loved her, who recognized her, who came up to her and asked for her autograph. These women were her old Broadway audience, and she despised them. Elderly Jewish women, particularly, she could not pass without a groan of disgust. "Look at those faces," she'd say with a shudder. "Look at those hideous faces." It was a sickness, Murray said, that aversion she had for the Jew who was insufficiently disguised. She could go along parallel to life for a long time, not in life, parallel to life. She could be quite convincing in that ultra-civilized, ladylike role she'd chosen. The soft voice, the precise locution. Back in the 20s, English genteel was a style that a lot of American girls worked up for themselves when they wanted to become actresses. And with Eve Frame, who was herself starting out in Hollywood then, it hardened. English genteel hardened into a form like layers of wax. Only burning right in the middle was the wick, this flaming wick that wasn't very genteel at all. She knew all the moves, the benign smile, the dramatic reserve, all the delicate gestures, but then she'd veer off that parallel course of hers, the thing that looks so much like life, and there'd be an episode that could leave you spinning. "And I never saw any of this," I said. She was always kind and considerate to me, sympathetic, trying to make me feel comfortable, which wasn't easy. I was an excitable kid, and she had a lot of the movie star clinging to her, even in those radio days. I was thinking again, as I spoke, of that night at the mosque. She said to me, who was finding it impossible to know what to say to her, that she didn't know what to say to Paul Robeson, that in his presence she was tongue-tied. "Are you as in awe of him as I am?" she whispered, as though both of us were 15 years old. "He is the most beautiful man I had ever seen. It's shameful. I cannot stop looking at him." I knew how she felt because I hadn't been able to stop looking at her, looking as though if I looked long enough, a meaning might emerge. Looking not only because of the delicacy of her gestures and the dignity of her bearing and the indeterminate elegance of her beauty, a beauty hovering between the darkly exotic and the softly demure and shifting continuously in its proportions, a type of beauty that must have been spellbinding at its height, but because of something visibly a quiver in her despite all the restraint, a volatility that at the time I associated with the sheer exaltation that must come of being Eve Frame. "Do you remember the day I met Ira?" I asked him. "You two were working together, taking the screens down on Lehigh Avenue. What was he doing at your place?" It was in October '48, a few weeks before the election. "Oh, that was a bad day." That day I remember very well. He was in a bad way, and he came to Newark that morning to stay with Doris and me. He slept on the couch for 2 nights. It was the first time that happened, Nathan. That marriage was a mismatch from the start. He'd already pulled something like it before, except at the other end of the social spectrum. You couldn't miss it. The enormous difference in temperament and interests. Anybody could see it. Ira couldn't. See? Ira? Well, to be generous about it, for one thing, he was in love with her. They met, and he fell for her. And the first thing he did, he went out and bought her a fancy Easter parade hat that she would never have worn because her taste in clothes was all Dior. But he didn't know what Dior was, and he bought her this big, ridiculous, expensive hat and had it delivered to her house after their first date. Love-struck and starstruck, he was dazzled by her. She was dazzling, and dazzlement has a logic all its own. What did she see in him, the big rube who hits New York and lands a job in a soap opera? Well, it's not a great riddle. After a short apprenticeship, he is not a simple rube. He's a star on The Free and the Brave, so there's that. Ira took on those heroes that he played. I never bought it, but the average listener believed in him as their embodiment. He had an aura of heroic purity. He believed in himself. And so he steps into the room, and bingo, he shows up at some party, and there she is. There is this lonely actress in her 40s, 3 times divorced, and there's this new face, this new guy, this tree. And she's needy, and she's famous, and she surrenders to him. Isn't that what happens? Every woman has her temptations, and surrendering is Eve's. Outwardly, a pure, gangling giant with huge hands who'd been a factory worker, who'd been a stevedore, who is now an actor. Pretty appealing, those guys. It's hard to believe something that raw can be that tender, too. Tender rawness. The goodness of a big, rough guy, all that stuff. Irresistible to her. How could a giant be anything else to her? There's something exotic to her about the amount of harsh life he's exposed himself to. She felt that he'd really lived, and after you heard her story, he felt that she really lived. When they meet, Sylphid's away in France for the summer with her father, and Ira doesn't get to see that stuff firsthand. And so these strong, if sui generis, maternal urges of hers Ira gets instead, and they have this idyll together all summer long. The guy never had a mother after the age of 7, and he's starved for the attentive, refined care that she lavishes on him, and they're living alone in the house, without the daughter, and ever since he came to New York, he's been living like a good member of the proletariat in some dump on the Lower East Side. He hangs out in cheap places and eats in cheap restaurants, and suddenly these two are isolated together on West 11th Street, and it's summer in Manhattan, and it's great. Its life is paradise. Sylphid's picture is all around the house, Sylphid as a little girl in her pinafore, and he finds it wonderful that Eve's so devoted. She tells the story of her horrible experiences with marriage and man. She tells him about Hollywood and the tyrannical directors and the Philistine producers, the terrible, terrible tawdriness, and it's Othello in reverse. 'Twas strange, 'twas passing strange, 'twas pitiful, 'twas wondrous pitiful. He loved her for the dangers she had passed. Ira's mystified, enchanted, and he's needed. He's big and he's physical, and so he rushes in. A woman with pathos, a beautiful woman with pathos and a story to tell, a spiritual woman with décolletage. Who better to activate his protective mechanism? He even takes her to Newark to meet us. We had a drink at our house, and then we all go down to Elizabeth Avenue to the tavern, and she behaves well. Nothing inexplicable. It seems so surprisingly easy to know what to make of her. That evening, he first brought Eve to our place, and we went out for dinner. I didn't see anything wrong myself. It's only fair to say that it's not Ira alone who can figure this out. He doesn't know who she is because, to be honest, nobody would have right off. Nobody could have. In society, Eve was invisible behind the disguise of all that civility. And so, though others might proceed slowly because of his nature, Ira, as I said, rushes right in. What registered on me right off weren't her inadequacies, but his. She struck me as too smart for him, too polished for him, certainly too cultivated. I thought, here's a movie star with a mind. Turned out she'd been reading conscientiously since she was a kid. I don't think there was a novel on my shelves that she couldn't talk about with familiarity. It even sounded that night as though her inmost pleasure in life were reading books. She remembered the complicated plots of 19th century novels. I would teach the books and I still couldn't remember them. Sure, she was showing her best side. Sure, like everyone else on her first meeting, like all of us, she was keeping a prudent watch over her worst side. But her best side was there. She had one. It looked real, and it was unostentatious, and in someone so renowned, that made it very winning. Sure, I saw, I couldn't help but see, that this was by no means a necessary union of souls. The two of them were more than likely without any affinity at all, but I was dazzled myself that first night by what I took to be her quiet substance on top of the looks. Don't forget the effect of fame. Doris and I had grown up on those silent films of hers. She was always cast with older men, tall men, often white-haired men, and she was a girlish, daughterly-looking thing, granddaughterly-looking thing, and the men were always wanting to kiss her, and she was always saying no. It took no more than that in those days to heat things up in a movie house. A movie of hers, maybe her first, was called Cigarette Girl. Eve's the cigarette girl, working in a nightclub, and at the end of the movie, as I remember, there's a charity event to which she's taken by the nightclub's owner. It's held at the Fifth Avenue mansion of a rich, stuffy dowager, and the cigarette girl is dressed up in a nurse's uniform, and the men are asked to bid to kiss her. Money that will go to the Red Cross. Each time, one man tops another's bid. Eve covers her mouth and giggles behind her hand like a geisha. The bidding goes higher and higher, and the stout society ladies looking on are aghast. But when a distinguished banker with a black mustache, Carlton Pennington, bids the astronomical sum of $1,000 and steps up to plant the kiss we've all been waiting to see, the ladies surge madly forward to watch. At the finale, instead of the kiss at the heart of the screen, there are their big corseted society behinds obscuring everything. Quite something that was in 1924. Quite something Eve was. The radiant smile, the hopeless shrug, the acting they did in those days with their eyes. She mastered it all as just a kid. She could do defeated, she could display temper, she could do crying with a hand to her forehead, she could do the funny pratfalls too. When Eve Frame was happy, she would do a run with a little skip in it, skipping with happiness, very charming. She played either the poor cigarette girl or the poor laundress who meets the swell, or she played the spoiled rich girl who is swept off her feet by the trolley conductor. Movies about crossing class barriers, street scenes of the immigrant poor with all their crude energy, and then dinner scenes of the privileged American rich with all their strictures and taboos. Baby Dreiser. You couldn't watch those things today. You could barely watch them then, if not for her. Doris and Eve and I were the same age. She started out in Hollywood when she was 17, and then, still, back before the war, she was on Broadway. Doris and I had seen her from up in the balcony in some of those plays, and she was good, you know. The plays weren't so wonderful, but as a stage actress, she had a direct way about her, unlike what had made her popular as the girlish, silent film star. On the stage, she had a talent for making things that weren't very intelligent seem intelligent, and things that weren't serious seem somewhat serious. Strange, her perfect equilibrium on the stage. As a human being, she wound up exaggerating everything. And yet as a stage actress, she was all moderation and tact, nothing exaggerated. And then, after the war, we'd hear her on the radio because Lorraine liked to listen, and even on those American radio theater shows, she brought an air of tastefulness to some pretty awful stuff. To have her in our living room looking through my bookshelves to talk to her about Meredith and Dickens and Thackeray, well, what is a woman with her experience and her interest doing with my brother? That night, I never figured on their getting married. Though his vanity was clearly flattered and he was excited and proud as hell of her over lobster thermidor at the tavern, the toniest restaurant Jews ate in Newark, and there escorting Eve Frame, the epitome of theatrical class, is the one-time roughneck from Newark's Factory Street, and not an ounce of uncertainty in him. Did you know that Ira was once a busboy at the tavern? One of his menial jobs after he quit school lasted about a month, too big to be rushing with those loaded trays through the kitchen door. They fired him after he broke his 1,000th dish, and that's when he headed up to Sussex County to the zinc mines. So, nearly 20 years pass, and he's back at the tavern, a radio star himself, and showing off that night for his brother and sister-in-law. The master of life, exulting in his own existence. The owner of the tavern, Sam Tiger, spots Eve and comes over to the table with a bottle of champagne, and Ira invites him to have a drink with us and regales him with the story of his 30 days as a tavern busboy in 1929. And now that his life hasn't come to nothing, everybody enjoys the comedy of his mishaps and the irony that Ira should ever have got back here. We all enjoy his sporting spirit about his own wounds. Tiger goes to his office, returns with a camera, he takes a picture of the four of us eating our dinner, and afterward it hangs in the tavern foyer, along with the photographs of all the other notables who ever dined there. No reason that picture wouldn't have hung there till the tavern closed for business after the 67 riots, had Ira not been blacklisted 16 years earlier. I understand they took it down then overnight as though his life had come to nothing. To go back to when their idyll first began, he heads home at night to this room he rented, but gradually enough he doesn't, and then he's at her place. And they're not kids, and the woman hasn't been up to much lately, and it's passionate and wonderful, locked up alone in that West 11th Street house like a pair of sex criminals tethered to the bed. All the spontaneous intrigue of that at the onset of middle age, letting go and falling into the affair. It's Eve's release, her liberation, her emancipation, her salvation. Ira's given her a new script if she wants it. At 41, she thought it was all over, and instead, she's been saved. Well, she says to him, so much for the patiently nurtured desire to keep things in perspective. She says things to him nobody's ever said to him before. She calls their affair our exceedingly, achingly sweet and strange thing. She tells him, it keeps dissolving me. She tells him, in the middle of a conversation with someone, I'm suddenly not there. She calls him Mon Prince. She quotes Emily Dickinson. For Ira Ringgold, Emily Dickinson. With thee in the desert, with thee in the thirst, with thee in the tamarind wood, leopard breathes at last. Well, it feels to Ira like the love of his life. And with the love of your life, you don't think about the particulars. If you find such a thing, you don't throw it away. They decide to get married. And that's what Eve tells Sylphid when she gets back from France. Mommy's getting married again, but this time to a wonderful man. Sylphid's supposed to buy that. Sylphid, from the old script. Eve Frame was the big world to Ira, and why shouldn't she have been? He was no baby. He'd been in a lot of rough places and knew how to be rough himself, but Broadway, Hollywood, Greenwich Village, all brand new to him. Ira wasn't the brightest guy around when it came to personal affairs. He taught himself a lot. He and O'Day had brought him a long, long way from Factory Street, but that was all political stuff, and that was not sharp thinking either. Wasn't thinking at all. The pseudo-scientific Marxist lexicon, the utopian cant that went with it, dish that stuff out to someone as unschooled and ill-educated as Ira, indoctrinate an adult who is not too skilled in brain work with the intellectual glamour of big, sweeping ideas, inculcate a man of limited intelligence, an excitable type who is as angry as Ira, but, well, that's a subject all its own, the connection between embitterment and not thinking. You're asking me about how we wound up in Newark that day you two met. Ira wasn't prone to going at life in ways that were conducive to solving the problems of a marriage. And it was early days. It was only a matter of months since the wedding to the star of stage, screen, and radio, and his moving into that townhouse of hers. How could I tell him it was a mistake? The guy wasn't without vanity, after all. He wasn't without conceit, my brother. Wasn't without scale, either. There was a theatrical instinct in Ira, an immodest attitude toward himself. Don't think he minded becoming someone of enhanced importance. That's an adaptation people seem able to implement in about 72 hours, and generally the effect is invigorating. Everything all at once filled with possibility, everything in motion, everything imminent. Ira in the drama in every sense of the word. He has pulled off a great big act of control over the story that was his life. He is all at once awash in the narcissistic illusion that he has been sprung from the realities of pain and loss, that his life is not futility, that it's anything but. No longer walking in the valley of the shadow of his limitations, no longer the excluded giant consigned to be the strange one forever. Barges in with that brash courage, and there he is, out of the grips of obscurity and proud of his transformation, the exhilaration of it, the naive dream. He's in it, the new Ira, the worldly Ira, a big guy with a big life. Watch out. Besides, I already had told him it was a mistake. And after that, we didn't talk for 6 weeks. And then only because I went to New York and explained to him I was wrong and begged him not to hold it against me did I get the guy back. He would have shot me down for good if I had tried it a second time. And a complete falling out, that would have been awful for both of us. I'd been taking care of Ira since he was born. I was 7 years old. I used to push him down Factory Street in his baby carriage. After our mother died, when my father remarried and a stepmother came into the house, if I hadn't been around, Ira would have wound up in reform school. We had a wonderful mother. And she didn't have such a good time of it either. She was married to our father. That was no picnic. What was your father like? I asked. We don't want to go into that. That's what Ira used to say. That's the only thing there is to say. We had a father who, well, much later in life, I learned what made him tick. But by then, it was too late. Anyway, I was luckier than my brother. When our mother died, after those awful months in the hospital, I was already in high school. Then I got a scholarship to the University of Newark. I was on my way, but Ira was still a kid. A tough kid, a crude kid, full of mistrust. Do you know about the canary funeral in the old First Ward, when one of the local shoemakers buried his pet canary? This will show you how tough Ira was and how tough he wasn't. It was in 1920. I was 13 and Ira was 7, and on Borden Street, a couple of streets away from our tenement, there was a cobbler, Russomano. Emilio Russomano, a poor-looking old guy, small, with big ears and a gaunt face, a white chin beard, and on his back a threadbare suit, 100 years old. For company in his shop, Russomano kept a pet canary. The canary was named Jimmy, and Jimmy lived a long time, and then Jimmy ate something he shouldn't have and died. Russomano was devastated, so he hired a parade band, rented a hearse and 2 coaches drawn by horses, and after the canary was laid out for viewing on a bench in the cobbler's shop, beautifully exhibited with flowers, candles, and a crucifix, there was a funeral procession through the streets of the whole district. Past Del Grecio's grocery store, where they had clams outside in bushel baskets and an American flag in the window, past Malilo's fruit and vegetable stand, past Giordano's bakery, past Mascalino's bakery, past Ari's Italian tasty crust bakery. It went past Biondi's butcher shop, and DeLuca's harness shop, and DeCarlo's garage, and DiNicenzo's coffee store, and Parisi's shoe store, and Nole's bicycle shop, and Celentano's latteria, and Grande's pool hall, and Basso's barbershop, and Esposito's barbershop, and the bootblock stand with the two scarlet dining chairs that the customers had to step up high onto a platform to get to. Gone now for 40 years. City knocked down the whole Italian neighborhood in 1953 to make way for low-rent, high-rise housing. In 1994, they blew the high-rises up on national TV. By then, nobody had been living in them for about 20 years. Uninhabitable. Now there's nothing there at all. St. Lucy's, that's it. That's all that's standing. The parish church. But no parish and no parishioners. Nicodemi's Cafe on 7th Avenue and Cafe Roma on 7th Avenue and Doria's Bank on 7th Avenue, that was the bank where, before the Second War broke out, they extended credit to Mussolini. When Mussolini took Ethiopia, the priest rang the church bells for half an hour, here in America, in Newark's First Ward. The macaroni factory and the decoration factory and the monument shop and the marionette playhouse and the movie theater and the bocce alleys and the ice house and the print shop and the clubhouses and the restaurants past the mobster Richie Boiardo's hangout, the Victory Cafe. In the 30s, when Boiardo got out of jail, he built the Vittorio Castle on the corner of 8th and Summer. Show business people used to travel from New York to dine at the castle. The castle is where Joe DiMaggio ate when he came to Newark. The castle is where DiMaggio and his girlfriend held their engagement party. It's from the castle that Boiardo lorded it over the First Ward. Richie Boiardo ruled the Italians in the First Ward, and Longis Willman ruled the Jews in the Third Ward, and these two gangsters were always at war. Past the dozens of neighborhood saloons, the procession wound from east to west, north up one street, south down the next, all the way to Clifton Avenue Municipal Bathhouse, the First Ward's most extravagant lump of architecture after the church and the cathedral. The massive old public bathhouse where my mother used to take us for a bath as babies. My father went there too, shower-free and a penny for the towel. The canary was placed in a small white coffin with 4 pallbearers to carry it. A huge crowd assembled, maybe as many as 10,000 people stretched out along the procession route. People were squeezed together on the fire escapes and up on the roofs. Whole families were hanging out of their tenement windows to watch. Russomano rode in the carriage behind the coffin. Emilio Russomano, weeping, while everybody else in the First Ward was laughing. Some people were laughing so hard, they wound up hurling themselves to the ground. They couldn't stand up from laughing so hard. Even the pallbearers were laughing. It was infectious. The guy driving the hearse was laughing. Out of respect for the mourner, people on the sidewalk tried to hold it in until Russomano's carriage had passed by, but it was just too hilarious for most of them, particularly for the kids. Ours was a tiny neighborhood swarming with kids in the alleys, kids crowding the stoops, kids pouring out of the tenements and stampeding from Clifton Avenue down to Broad Street all day long. And during the summertime, through half the night, you could hear these kids shouting to one another, "Guayo! Guayo!" Everywhere you looked, bands of kids, battalions of kids, pitching pennies, playing cards, rolling dice, shooting pool, licking ices, playing ball, making bonfires, frightening girls. Only the nuns with rulers could control these kids. Thousands and thousands of boys there were, all under 10 years old. Ira was one of them. Thousands and thousands of scrappy little Italian kids, the children of the Italians who laid the railroad tracks and paved the streets and dug the sewers, the children of peddlers and factory workers and rag pickers and saloon keepers. Kids called Giuseppe and Rodolfo, Raffaele and Gaetano, and the one Jewish kid called Ira. Well, the Italians were having the time of their lives. They'd never seen anything like that canary's funeral. They never saw anything like it again. Sure, there were funeral processions before that, and there were bands playing funeral dirges and mourners surging through the streets. There were the feast days all year round with processions for all those saints they brought over with them from Italy. Hundreds and hundreds of people venerating their society's special saint by dressing up and bearing the saint's embroidered flag and carrying candles the size of tire irons. And there was St. Lucy's Presepio for Christmas, a replica of a Neapolitan village depicting the birth of Jesus, 100 Italian figurines planted in it, along with Mary, Joseph, and the Bambino. There were the Italian bagpipes parading with the plaster Bambino, and behind the Bambino, the people in the procession singing Italian Christmas carols. And the vendors out along the street selling eel for Christmas Eve dinner. People turned out in droves for the religious stuff, and they stuck dollar bills all over the robe of the plaster statue of whatever saint it was, and they threw flower petals out their windows like ticket tape. They even released birds from cages, doves that flew crazily above the crowd from one telephone pole to the next. On a saint's day, the doves must have been wishing they'd never seen the outside of a bird cage. On the Feast of St. Michael, the Italians would dress up a couple of little girls as angels. From the fire escapes on either side of the street, they'd swing them over the crowd from ropes the girls were harnessed to. Little skinny girls in white gowns with halos and wings attached, and the crowd would go silent with awe when they appeared in the air, chanting some prayer. And when the girls had finished being angels, the crowd went nuts. That's when they would set the doves free, and that's when the fireworks would explode, and somebody would wind up in the hospital with a couple of fingers blown off. So, lively spectacle was nothing new to the Italians in the First Ward. Funny characters, old country carrying on, noise and fights and colorful stunts, nothing new. Funerals certainly weren't new. During the flu epidemic, so many people died that the coffins had to be lined up on the street. 1918. The funeral parlors couldn't handle the business. Behind the coffins, processions from St. Lucy's wended the couple miles to Holy Sepulchre Cemetery all day long. There were tiny coffins for the babies. You had to wait your turn to bury your baby. You had to wait for your neighbors to bury theirs first. Unforgettable terror for a kid. And yet, 2 years after the flu epidemic, the funeral for Jimmy the Canary. Well, that topped them all. Everybody there that day was in stitches. Except for one person. Ira was the only one in Newark who wasn't in on the joke. I couldn't explain it to him. I tried, but he couldn't understand why. Maybe because he was stupid, or maybe because he wasn't stupid. Maybe he simply was not born with the mentality of the carnival. Maybe utopianists aren't. Or maybe it was because our mother had died a few months early and we had our own funeral that Ira had wanted no part of. He wanted to be out on the street instead, kicking a ball around. He begged me not to make him change out of his overalls and go to the cemetery. He tried hiding in the closet, but he came along with us anyway. My father saw to that. At the cemetery, he stood there watching us bury her, but he refused to take my hand or let me put my arm around him. He just scowled at the rabbi, glowered at him, refused to be touched or comforted by anyone. Didn't cry either, not a tear. He was too angry for tears. But when the canary died, everybody at the funeral was laughing away except Ira. Ira knew Jimmy only from walking by the cobbler shop on the way to school and looking in the window at his cage. I don't believe he ever stepped inside the shop, and yet, aside from Rusomano, he was the only one around who was in tears. When I started to laugh, because it was funny, Nathan, very funny, Ira lost control completely. That was the first time I saw that happen to Ira. He started swinging his fist and screaming at me. He was a big kid even then, and I couldn't rein him in. And suddenly he was swinging at a couple of kids next to us who were also laughing themselves sick. And when I reached down to try to pluck him up and save him from being slaughtered by a whole slew of kids, one of his fists caught me on the nose. He broke my nose at the bridge. A 7-year-old. I was bleeding. The damn thing was obviously broken, and so Ira ran away. We didn't find him till the next day. He'd slept back at the brewery on Clifton Avenue. It wasn't the first time. In the yard, under the loading dock, my father found him there in the morning. He dragged him by the scruff of the neck all the way to school and into the room where Ira's class was already in session. When the kids saw Ira wearing those filthy overalls he slept in all night and being flung into the room by his old man, they began to go, boo-hoo. And that was Ira's nickname for months afterward. Boo-hoo Ringgold, the Jew boy who cried at the Canary funeral. Luckily, Ira was always bigger than the others his age, and he was strong, and he could play ball. Ira would have been a star athlete if it hadn't been for his eyes. What respect he got in that neighborhood, he got from playing ball. But the fights? From then on, he was in fights all the time. That's when his extremism began. It was a blessing, that we didn't grow up in the Third Ward with the poor Jews. Growing up in the First Ward, Ira was always a loudmouth kike outsider to the Italians, and so however big and strong and belligerent he was, Boiardo could never perceive him as local talent auditioning for the mob. But in the Third Ward, among the Jews, it might have been different. There, Ira wouldn't have been the official outcast among the kids. If only because of his size, he would probably have come to Longie's Wilman's attention. From what I understand, Longie, who was 10 years older than Ira, was a lot like Ira growing up, furious. A big, menacing boy who also quit school, who was fearless in a street fight, and who had the commanding looks along with something of a brain. In bootlegging and gambling and vending machines on the docks, in the labor movement, in the building trades, Longie eventually made it big. But even at the top, when he was teamed up with Bugsy Siegel and Lansky and Lucky Luciano, his closest intimates or the friends he'd grown up with in the streets. Third Ward Jewish boys like himself, whom it took little to provoke. Niggy Rutkin, his hitman, Sam Katz, his bodyguard, George Goldstein, his accountant, Billy Tiplitz, his numbers man, Doc Stacher, his adding machine, Abe Lou, Longy's cousin, ran the retail clerks union for Longy. Christ, Maya Ellenstein, another street kid from the Third Ward ghetto. When he was mayor of Newark, Ellenstein all but ran the city for Longy. Ira could have wound up one of Longy's henchmen, loyally doing one of their jobs. He was ripe for recruitment. There would have been nothing aberrant in it. Crime was what those boys were bred for. It was the next logical step. Had that violence in them that you need as a business tactic in the rackets to inspire fear and gain the competitive edge. Ira could have started off down at Port Newark, unloading the bootleg whiskey from Canada out of the speedboats and into Longy's trucks, and he could have ended up like Longy with a millionaire's mansion in West Orange and a rope around his neck. It's so fickle, isn't it, who you wind up with, how you wind up. It's only because of a tiny accident of geography that the opportunity to string along with Longy never came Ira's way. The opportunity to launch a successful career by using a blackjack on Longy's competitors, by putting the squeeze on Longy's customers, by supervising the gaming tables at Longy's casinos. The opportunity to conclude it by testifying for 2 hours in front of the Kefauver committee before going home to hang himself. When Ira met someone tougher and smarter than him who was going to be the big influence, he was already in the Army, and so it wasn't a Newark gangster, but a communist steelworker who worked the transformation on him. Ira's Longy's Willman was Johnny O'Day. Why didn't I tell him that first time he stayed over with us to can the marriage and get out? Because that marriage, that woman, that beautiful house, all those books, records, and paintings on the wall, that life she had full of accomplished people, polished, interesting, educated people, it was everything he'd ever known. Forget that he was now somebody himself. The guy had a home. He never had that before. And he was, by then, 35. 35, and he wasn't living in a room anymore, wasn't eating in cafeterias anymore, wasn't sleeping with waitresses and barmaids and worse, women, some of them who couldn't write their names. After his discharge, when he first got to Calumet City to live with O'Day, Ira had an affair with a 19-year-old stripper, a girl named Donna Jones. Ira met her in the laundromat. Thought at first she was a local high school kid, and for a while she didn't bother to set him straight. Petite, scrappy, brassy, tough. At least the surface was tough. And she's a little pleasure factory. The kid has her hand on her pussy all the time. Donna's from Michigan, a resort town on the lake called Benton Harbor. In Benton Harbor, Donna used to work summers at a hotel on the lakefront. 16, a chambermaid, and she gets knocked up by one of the customers over from Chicago. Which one? She doesn't know. Carries the baby to term, gives it up for adoption, leaves town in disgrace, and winds up stripping on one of those Cal City joints. When he wasn't out being Abe Lincoln for the Union on Sundays, Ira used to borrow O'Day's car to take Donna over to Benton Harbor to visit her mother. The mother worked in a little factory that manufactured candy and fudge, stuff they sold to the vacationers on Benton Harbor's Main Street. Resort suites. The fudge was famous. Shipped fudge all over the Middle West. Ira starts talking to the guy who runs the candy factory. He sees how they make the stuff, and pretty soon he's writing to me about marrying Donna and moving back with her to her hometown, living in a bungalow on the lake, and using what's left of his separation pay to buy into this guy's business. There was also the $1,000 he'd won shooting craps on the troop ship coming home. All of it could go into the candy business. That Christmas, he mailed Lorraine a gift box of fudge. 16 different flavors. Chocolate coconut, peanut butter, pistachio, mint chocolate chip, Rocky Road, all fresh and creamy, direct from the fudge kitchen in Benton Harbor, Michigan. Tell me, what could be further from being a raving red, hell-bent on overthrowing the American system than being a guy in Michigan who gift wraps fudge to mail out to your old auntie for the holiday season? Goodies made by the lake. That's the slogan on the box. Not Workers of the World Unite, but goodies made by the lake. If only Ira had married Donna Jones, that would have been the slogan he lived by. It was O'Day, not me, who talked him out of Donna. Not because a 19-year-old featured at the Cal City Kit Kat Club as Miss Shalimar, recommended for good eating by Duncan Hines, might in any way be a bad risk as a wife and mother. Not because the missing Mr. Jones, Donna's father, was a drunk who used to beat his wife and kids, not because the Benton Harbor Joneses were ignorant rednecks, and not a family somebody back from 4 years in the service should be wanting to take on as a lasting responsibility, which is what I politely tried to tell him. But to Ira, everything that was a guaranteed recipe for domestic disaster constituted the argument for Donna. The law of the underdog, the struggle of the disinherited up from the bottom was an irresistible lure. You drink deep, you drink dregs. Humanity to Ira was synonymous with hardship and calamity. Toward hardship, even its disreputable forms, the kinship was unbreakable. It took O'Day to undo the all-around aphrodisiac that was Donna Jones and the 16 flavors of fudge. It was O'Day who tore into him for personalizing his politics, and O'Day didn't do it with my bourgeois reasoning. O'Day didn't apologize for presuming to criticize Ira's shortcomings. O'Day never apologized for anything. O'Day set people straight. O'Day gave Ira what he called a refresher course in matrimony as it pertains to the world revolution, based on his own encounter with marriage before the war. Is this what you came out with me to the Calumet for? To prepare to run a candy factory or to run a revolution? This is no time for ridiculous aberrations. This is it, boy. This is life or death for working conditions as we've known them for the past 10 years. All the factions and groups are coming together right here in Lake County. You see that? If we can hold this pitch, if nobody jumps ship, then damn it, Iron Man, in a year, 2 at most, the mills will be ours. So, some 8 months on, Ira told Donna it was all off, and she swallowed some pills and tried to kill herself a little. About a month later, Donna's by then back at the Kit Kat and got herself a new guy. Her long-lost drunken father turns up with one of Donna's brothers at Ira's door saying he's going to teach Ira a lesson for what he did to his daughter. Ira's in the doorway fighting the two of them off, and the father pulls a knife. And O'Day takes one swing and breaks the bastard's jaw and grabs the knife. That was the first family Ira was going to marry into. From such a farce, it's not always a short way back, but by 48, the putative savior of little Donna has become Iron Rin of the free and the brave and is up and ready for his next big mistake. You should have heard him when he learned Eve was pregnant. A child, a family of his own, and not with an ex-stripper whom his brother had disapproved of, but with a renowned actress whom American Radioland adored. It was the greatest thing ever to come his way, that solid foothold he'd never had before. He could hardly believe it. 2 years, and this. The man wasn't impermanent anymore. She was pregnant? When was that? After they were married. It didn't last but 10 weeks. That's why he stayed with me and how you two met. She decided to abort. We were sitting out back on the deck, looking toward the pond and in the distance to the mountain range in the west. I live here by myself, and the house is small, a room where I write and eat my meals, a workroom with a bathroom and a kitchen alcove off at one end, a stone fireplace at right angles to a wall of books, and a row of 5 12-over-12 sash windows looking onto the broad hayfield and a protective squadron of old maples that separates me from the dirt road. The other room is where I sleep. A nice-size, rustic-looking room with a single bed, a dresser, a wood-burning stove, exposed old beams upright in the 4 corners, more bookshelves, an easy chair where I do my reading, a small writing desk, and, in the west wall, a sliding glass door that opens onto the deck where Murray and I were each drinking a martini before dinner. I'd bought the house, winterized it, it had been somebody's summer cottage, and come here when I was 60 to live alone, by and large, apart from people. That was 4 years ago. Though it isn't always desirable living as austerely as this, without the varied activities that ordinarily go to make up a human existence, I believe I made the least harmful choice. But my seclusion is not the story here. It's not a story in any way. I came here because I don't want a story any longer. I've had my story. I wondered if Murray had as yet recognized my house as an upgraded replica of the 2-room shack on the Jersey side of the Delaware water gap that was Ira's beloved retreat, and the spot where I happened to have got my first taste of rural America when I went up in the summers of 49 and 50 to spend a week with him. I'd loved my first time living alone with Ira in that shack, and I thought of his place immediately when I was shown this house. Though I had been looking for something larger and more conventionally a house, I bought it right off. The rooms were about the same size as Ira's and similarly situated. The long oval pond was about the same dimensions as his, and about the same distance from the back door. And though my place was much brighter, over time his stained pine board walls had gone almost black, the beam ceilings were low, ridiculously low for him, and the windows were small and not that plentiful. Mine was tucked away on a dirt road as his was, and if, from the outside, it didn't have that dark, drooping ramshackle look that proclaimed, "Hermit, here, back off," the owner's state of mind was discernible in the absence of anything like a path across the hay field that led to the bolted front door. There was a narrow dirt drive that swung up and around to the workroom side of the house, to an open shed where in the winter I parked my car. A tumble-down wooden structure that predated the cottage, the shed could have been lifted right off Ira's overgrown 8 acres. How did the idea of Ira's shack maintain its hold so long? Well, it's the earliest images of independence and freedom, particularly, that do live obstinately on despite the blessing and the bludgeoning of life's fullness. And the idea of the shack, after all, isn't Ira's. It has a history. It was Rousseau's. It was Thoreau's. The palliative of the primitive hut. The place where you are stripped back to the essentials to which you return, even if it happens not to be where you came from. To decontaminate and absolve yourself of the striving. The place where you disrobe, molt it all, the uniforms you've worn and the costumes you've gotten into, where you shed your batteredness and your resentment, your appeasement of the world and your defiance of the world, your manipulation of the world and its manhandling of you. The aging man leaves and goes into the woods. Eastern philosophical thought abounds with that motif. Taoist thought, Hindu thought, Chinese thought. The forest dweller, the last stage on life's way. Think of those Chinese paintings of the old man under the mountain, the old Chinese man all alone under the mountain, receding from the agitation of the autobiographical. He has entered vigorously into competition with life. Now, becalmed, he enters into competition with death, drawn down into austerity, the final business. The martinis were Murray's idea. A good, though not a great idea, since a drink at the end of a summer's day with somebody I enjoyed, talk with a person like Murray, made me remember the pleasures of companionship. I'd enjoyed a lot of people, had not been an indifferent participant in life, had not backed away from it. But the story is Ira's, why it was impossible for him. He wanted a boy, Murray said. Was dying to name it after his friend Johnny O'Day Ringgold. Doris and I had Lorraine, our daughter, and whenever he stayed over on the couch, Lorraine could always lift his spirits. Lorraine used to like to watch Ira sleep, like standing in the doorway watching Lemuel Gulliver sleep. He got attached to that little girl with those black bangs of hers, and she to him. When he came to the house, she'd get him to play with her Russian nested dolls. He'd given them to her for a birthday. You know, a traditional Russian woman in a babushka, the one replica nestles inside the other till you get down to the nut-sized doll at the core. They'd make up stories about each of the dolls and how hard these little people worked in Russia. Then he'd nestle the whole thing in one of those hands of his so that you couldn't even see it. Just disappear, whole, inside those spatulate fingers. Such long, peculiar fingers, the fingers Paganini must have had. Lorraine loved it when he did that. The biggest nesting doll of them all was this enormous uncle. For Lorraine's next birthday, he bought her the album of the Soviet Army chorus and band performing Russian songs. More than 100 men in that chorus, another 100 in the band. The bass's portentous rumblings, terrific sound. She and Ira would have had a great time with those records. The singing was in Russian, and they'd listen together, and Ira would pretend to be the bass soloist, mouthing the incomprehensible words and making dramatic Russian gestures. And when the refrain came, Lorraine would mouth the incomprehensible words of the chorus. My kid knew how to be a comedian. There was one song she especially loved. It was beautiful, too, a stirring, mournful, hymn-like folk song called Dubinushka, a simple song sung with a balalaika in the background. The words to Dubinishka were printed in English on the inside of the album cover, and she learned them by heart and went around the house singing them for months. Many songs I have heard in my native land, songs of joy and sorrow, but one of them was deeply engraved in my memory. It's the song of the common worker. That was the solo part, but what she liked best to sing was the choral refrain because it had heave-ho in it. Lift up the cudgel, heave-ho, pull harder together, heave-ho. When Lorraine was by herself in her room, she'd line up all the hollow dolls and put on the Dubinishka record, and she'd sing tragically, heave-ho, heave-ho, while pushing the dolls this way and that way all over the floor. Stop a minute, Murray, wait, I said, and I got up, and I went from the deck into the house, into my bedroom where I had my CD player and my old phonograph. Most of my records were boxed and stored in a closet, but I knew in which box to find what I was looking for. I took out the album Ira had given to me back in 1948 and removed the record on which Dubinishka was performed by the Soviet Army Chorus and Band. I pushed the RPM switch to 78, dusted the record, and put it on the turntable. I placed the needle into the margin just before the record's last band, turned the volume up loud enough so that Murray could hear the music through the open doors separating my bedroom from the deck, and went out to rejoin him. In the dark, we listened, though now neither I to him nor he to me, but both of us to Dubinishka. It was just as Murray had described it, beautiful, a stirring, mournful, hymn-like folk song. Except for the crackle off the worn surface of the old record, a cyclical sound not unlike some familiar natural night noise of the summer countryside, the song seemed to be traveling to us from a remote historical past. It wasn't at all like lying on my deck listening on the radio to the Saturday night concerts live from Tanglewood. Heave-ho, heave-ho was out of a distant place and time, a spectral residue of those rapturous revolutionary days when everyone craving for change programmatically, naively, madly, unforgivably, underestimates how mankind mangles its noblest ideas and turns them into tragic farce. Heave-ho, heave-ho, as though human wiliness, weakness, stupidity, and corruption didn't stand a chance against the collective, against the might of the people pulling together to renew their lives and abolish injustice. Heave-ho. When Dubinishka was over, Murray was silent, and I began to hear once again everything I had filtered out while listening to him talk. The snores, twangs, and trills of the frogs, the rails in Blue Swamp, the reedy marsh just east of my house, cucking and kicking and kick-ticking away, and the wrens there chattering their accompaniment, and the loons, the crying and the laughing of the manic, depressive loons. Every few minutes there was the whinny of a distant screech owl, and continuously throughout the western New England string ensemble of crickets sawed away at cricket bartok. A raccoon twittered in the nearby woods, and as time wore on, I even thought I was hearing the beavers gnawing on a tree back where the woodland tributaries feed my pond. Some deer, fooled by the silence, must have prowled too close to the house, for all at once the deer, having sensed our presence, their Morse code of flight is swiftly sounded, the snorting, the in-place thud, the stamping, hooves pounding, the bounding away. Their bodies barge gracefully into the thicket of scrub, and then subaudibly they race for their lives. Only Murray's murmurous breathing is heard, the eloquence of an old man evenly expirating. Close to half an hour must have passed before he spoke. The arm of the phonograph hadn't returned to the starting position, and now I could hear the needle, too, whirring atop the label. I didn't go in to fix it and interrupt whatever it was that had quieted my storyteller and created the intensity of his silence. I wondered how long it would be before he said something. If perhaps he wouldn't speak at all, but just get up and ask to be driven back to the dormitory. If whatever thoughts had been set loose in him would require a full night's sleep to subdue. But softly laughing, Murray said at last, "That hit me." Did it? Why? I miss my girl. Where is she? Lorraine is dead. When did that happen? Lorraine died 26 years ago, 1971. Died at 30, leaving 2 kids and a husband, meningitis. And overnight, she was dead. And Doris is dead? Doris? Sure. I went into the bedroom to lift the needle and return it to its rest. "You want to hear more?" I called to Murray. He laughed heartily this time and said, "Trying to see how much I can take? Your idea of my strength, Nathan, is just a little too grand. I've met my match in Dubinushk." "I doubt that," I said, going back outside and sitting in my chair. "You were telling me, I was telling you, yes, that when Ira got booted off the air, Lorraine was desolate. She was only 9 or 10, but she was up in arms. After Ira got fired for being a communist, she wouldn't salute the flag." "The American flag? Where?" "At school. Where else do you salute the flag?" The teacher tried to protect her, took her to one side and said, "You have to salute the flag," but this child wouldn't do it. A lot of anger. The real Ringgold anger. She loved her uncle. She took after him. What happened? I had a long talk with her, and she got back to saluting the flag. What did you tell her? I told her I loved my brother, too. I didn't think it was right either. I told her I thought, as she did, that it was dead wrong to fire a person for his political beliefs. I believed in freedom of thought, absolute freedom of thought, but I told her you don't go looking for that kind of fight. It's not an important issue. What are you achieving? What are you winning? I told her, don't pick a fight you know you can't win, one that isn't even worth winning. I told her what I used to try to tell my brother about the problem of impassioned speech. Tried from the time he was a little kid for all the good it did him. It's not being angry that's important. It's being angry about the right things. I told her, look at it from the Darwinian perspective. Anger is to make you effective. That's its survival function. That's why it's given to you. If it makes you ineffective, drop it like a hot potato. As my teacher some 50 years earlier, Murray Ringgold used to play things up, make a show out of the lesson, dozens of tricks to get us to stay alert. Teaching was a passionate occupation for him, and he was an exciting guy. But now, though by no means an old man who'd run out of juice, he no longer found it necessary to tear himself apart to make clear his meaning, but had brought himself close to being totally dispassionate. His tone was more or less unvaried, mild. No attempt to lead you or mislead you by being overtly expressive with his voice or his face or his hands, not even when singing heave-ho, heave-ho. His skull looked so fragile and small now, yet within it were cradled 90 years of the past. There was a great deal in there. All the dead were there, for one thing, their deeds and their misdeeds converging with all the unanswerable questions, those things about which he can never be sure, to produce for him an exacting task, to reckon fairly, to tell this story without too much error. Time, we know, goes very fast near the end, but Murray had been near the end so long that when he spoke as he did, patiently, to the point with a certain blandness, only intermittently pausing to wholeheartedly sip that martini, I had the feeling that time had dissolved for him, that it ran neither quickly nor slowly, that he was no longer living in time, but exclusively within his own skin, as though that active, effortful, outgoing life as a conscientious teacher and citizen and family man had been a long battle to reach a state of ardorlessness. Aging into decrepitude was not unendurable, and neither was the unfathomability of oblivion. Neither was everything's coming down to nothing. It had all been endurable, even despising, without remission, the despicable. In Murray Ringgold, I thought, human dissatisfaction has met its match. He has outlived dissatisfaction. This is what remains after the passing of everything. The disciplined sadness of stoicism. This is the cooling. For so long, it's so hot. Everything in life is so intense. And then, little by little, it goes away. And then comes the cooling, and then come the ashes. The man who first taught me how to box with a book is back now to demonstrate how you box with old age. And an amazing, noble skill it is, for nothing teaches you less about old age than having lived a robust life. The reason Ira came to see me, Murray continued, and to stay overnight with us the day before you two met, was because of what he'd heard that morning. She told him about wanting the abortion. No, she already told him that the night before. Told him that she was going to Camden for an abortion. There was a doctor in Camden whom a lot of rich people went to back when abortion was a dodgy business. Her decision didn't come as a total surprise. For weeks she'd been back and forth, uncertain what to do. She was 41 years old. She was older than Ira. Her face didn't show it, but Ephraim wasn't a kid. She was concerned to be having a baby at her age. Ira understood that, but he couldn't accept it and refused to believe that her being 41 was something to stand in their way. He wasn't that cautious, you know. He had that all-out steamrolling side, and so he tried and tried to convince her that they had nothing to worry about. He thought he had convinced her, but a new issue emerged: work. It'd been hard enough to tend a career and a child the first time around with Sylphid, the daughter. Eve was only 18 when Sylphid was born. She was a starlet then out in Hollywood. She was married to that actor Pennington. Big name when I was young. Carlton Pennington, the silent film hero with a profile molded precisely to classical specifications. Tall, slender, graceful man with hair as dark and sleek as a raven and a dark mustache. Elegant to the marrow of his bones. Member in good standing of both the social aristocracy and the aristocracy of Eros. His acting capitalizes on the interplay of both. A fairy tale prince and a carnal powerhouse. In one, guaranteed to drive you to ecstasy in a silver-plated Pierce arrow. Studio arranged the wedding. She and Pennington had made such a hit together, and she was so enamored of him that the studio decided they ought to get married. And once they were married, they ought to have a child. All this was to squelch the rumors that Pennington was gay, which, of course, he was. In order to marry Pennington, there was a first husband to be gotten rid of. Pennington was the second husband. The first was a fellow named Mueller, whom she'd run away with when she was 16. An uneducated roughneck, just back from 5 years in the Navy, a big, burly German-American boy who'd grown up the son of a bartender in Kearney near Newark. Crude background, crude guy. Sort of Ira without the idealism. She met him at a neighborhood theater group. He wanted to be an actor, and she wanted to be an actress. He was living in a boarding house, and she was in high school and still living at home, and they ran off together to Hollywood. That's how he wound up in California, eloped as a kid with the bartender's boy. Within the year, she was a star. And so, as to get rid of Mueller, who was nothing, her studio paid him off. Mueller did appear in a few silent films as part of the payoff, and he even had a couple of roles as a tough in the first talkies, but his connection to Eve was all but erased from the record books. Until much later on, that is. We'll get back to Mueller. The point is that she marries Pennington. A coup for everyone. There's the studio wedding, there's the little baby, and then the 12 years with Pennington, living the life of a nun. She used to take Sylphid to see Pennington in Europe, even after she married Ira. Pennington's dead now, but he lived on the French Riviera after the war. He had a villa up in the hills back of Saint-Tropez. Drunk every night, on the prowl, a bitter ex-somebody ranting and raving about the Jews who run Hollywood, who ruined his career. She'd take Sylphid over to France to see Pennington, and they'd all go out for dinner in Saint-Tropez, and he'd drink a couple of bottles of wine and be staring all through dinner at some waiter, and then he'd send Sylphid and Eve back to the hotel. The next morning, they'd go to Pennington's for breakfast, and the waiter would be at the table in a bathrobe, and they'd all have fresh figs together. Eve would return to Ira in tears, saying that the man was fat and drunk, and there was always some 18-year-old sleeping there, a waiter or a beach bum or a street cleaner, and she could never go to France again. But back she went, for good or bad. She took Sylphid to Saint-Tropez 2 or 3 times a year to see her father. Couldn't have been easy on the kid. After Pennington, Eve marries a real estate speculator, this guy Friedman, who she claims spent everything she had and all but got her to sign over the house. So when Ira shows up on the radio scene in New York, naturally she falls for him. The noble rail splitter, outgoing, unpolluted, a great big walking conscience, yapping away about justice and equality for all. Ira and his ideals had attracted all sorts, from Donna Jones to Eve Frame and everything problematic in between. Women in distress were crazy about him. The vitality, the energy, the Samson-like revolutionary giant, the luggish sort of chivalry he had, and Ira smelled good. Do you remember that? A natural smell of his. Lorraine used to say, Uncle Ira smells like maple syrup. He did. He smelled like sap. In the beginning, the fact that Eve would deliver up her daughter to Pennington used to drive Ira nuts. I think he felt that it wasn't only to give Sylphid a chance to see Pennington, that there was still something about Pennington that Eve found attractive. And maybe she did. Maybe it was Pennington's queerness. Maybe it was that well-born background. Pennington was old California money. That's the money he lived on in France. Some of the jewelry that Sylphid wore was Spanish jewelry collected by her father's family. Ira would say to me, his daughter is in the house with him in one room, and he's in another room with a sailor. She should protect her daughter from that stuff. She shouldn't drag her over to France to have her witness stuff like that. Why doesn't she protect her daughter? I know my brother. I know what he wants to say. He wants to say, I forbid you to go ever again. I told him, you're not the girl's father. You can't forbid her kid to do anything. I said, if you want to leave the marriage because of this, leave it because of this. Otherwise, stay and live with it. It was the first shot I had at even hinting at what I'd been wanting to say all along. Having a fling with her was one thing. A movie star, why not? But marriage? Glaringly wrong in every way. This woman has no contact with politics, and especially not with communism. Knows her way around the complicated plots of the Victorian novelists, can rattle off the names of the people in Trollope, but completely unknowing about society and the workaday doings of anything. The woman is dressed by Dior, fabulous clothes, owns 1,000 little hats with little veils, shoes, and handbags made out of reptiles, spends lots of money on clothes, while Ira is a guy who spends $4.99 for a pair of shoes. He finds one of her bills for an $800 dress, doesn't even know what this means. He goes to a closet and looks at the dress and tries to figure out how it can cost so much. As a communist, he should be irritated by her from the first second. So what explains this marriage with her and not with a comrade? In the party, couldn't he have found somebody who supported him, who was together with him in the fight? Doris always excused him and made allowances for him. Came to Ira's defense every time I started in. Yes, Doris said, he is a communist, a big revolutionary, a party member with his kind of zeal, and he suddenly falls in love with an unthinking actress in this year's ladylike, waspy waist jacket and long skirts, who is famous and beautiful, who is steeped like a tea bag in aristocratic pretensions, and it contradicts his entire moral standard. But this is love. Is it? I would ask her. Looks like credulity and confusion to me. Ira has no intuition about emotional questions. The lack of emotional intuition goes along with his being the kind of flat-footed radical he is. Those people are not very psychologically attuned. But Doris's rebuttal is to justify him by nothing less than the annihilating power of love. Love, says Doris. Love is not something that is logical. Vanity is not something that is logical. Ira is not something that is logical. Each of us in this world has his own vanity and therefore his own tailor-made blindness. Eve Frame is Ira's. Even at his funeral, where there weren't 20 people, Doris stood up and made a speech on this very subject, a woman who dreaded speaking in public. She said he was a communist with a weakness for life. He was an impassioned communist who was not, however, made to live in the closed enclave of the party, and that was what subverted and destroyed him. He wasn't perfect from the communist point of view, thank God. The personal he could not renounce. The personal kept bursting out of Ira, militant and single-minded though he would try to be. It's one thing to have your party allegiance, and it's also one thing to be who you are and not able to restrain yourself. There was no side of himself that he could suppress. Ira lived everything personally, Doris said, to the hilt, including his contradictions. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. The contradictions were indisputable. The personal openness and the communist secrecy, the home life and the party, the need for a child, the desire for a family. Should a party member with his aspirations care about having a child like that? Even to one's contradictions, one might impose a limit. A guy from the streets marries an artiste. A guy in his 30s marries a woman in her 40s with a big adult baby who is still living at home. The incompatibilities were endless, but then that was the challenge. With Ira, the more that's wrong, the more to correct. I told him, Ira, the situation with Pennington is uncorrectable. The only way to correct it is by not being there. I told him more or less what O'Day had been telling him back with Donna. This is not politics. This is private life. You cannot bring to private life the ideology that you bring to the great world. You cannot change her. What you've got, you've got. If it's insufferable, then leave. This is a woman who married a homosexual, lived 12 years untouched by a homosexual husband, and who continues her involvement with him even though he behaves in front of their daughter in a way that she considers detrimental to her daughter's well-being. She must consider it even more detrimental for Sylphid not to see her father at all. She's caught in a dilemma. Probably there is no right thing for her to do, so let it be. Don't bother her about it, let it go. Then I asked, tell me, are other things insufferable? Other things you want to go in and change? Because if there are, forget it. You cannot change anything. But change was what Ira lived for, why he lived strenuously. It's the essence of the man that he treats everything as a challenge to his will. He must always make the effort. He must change everything. For him, that was the purpose of being in the world. Everything he wanted to change was here. But as soon as you want passionately what is beyond your control, you're primed to be thwarted. You are preparing to be brought to your knees. Tell me, I said to Ira, if you were to put all the insufferable things in a column and draw a line under them and add them up, do they add up to totally insufferable? Because if they do, then even if you only got there the day before yesterday, even if this marriage is still brand new, you must go. Because your tendency when you make a mistake is not to go. Your tendency is to correct things in that vehement way that the people in this family like to correct things. That's a worry to me right now. He had already told me about Eve's third marriage, the marriage after Pennington, to Friedman, and so I said to him, sounds like one disaster after another. And you are going to do what exactly? Undo the disasters? The great emancipator off the stage as well as on? Is that why you seek her out in the first place? You're going to show her that you're a bigger and better man than the great Hollywood star? You're going to show her that a Jew isn't a rapacious capitalist like Friedman, but a justice-making machine like you? Doris and I had been to dinner there already. I had seen the Pennington Frame family in action, and so I unloaded about that too. I unloaded everything. That daughter is a time bomb, Ira, resentful, sullen, baleful, a person narrowly focused on exhibiting herself who otherwise is not there. She's a strong-willed person used to getting what she wants, and you, Ira Ringgold, are in her way. Sure, you're strong-willed too, and bigger, and older, and a man, but you will not be able to make your will known. Where the daughter is concerned, you can have no moral authority because you are bigger and older and a man. That is going to be a source of frustration to a tycoon in the moral authority racket like you. In you, the daughter is going to discover the meaning of a word that she could never have begun to learn from her mother: resistance. You are a 6'6" hindrance, a hazard to her tyranny over the star who is Mom. I used strong language. I was an intense fellow myself in those days. I would get unsettled by the irrational, particularly when it emanated from my brother. I was more vehement than I should have been, but I didn't really overstate the case. I saw it right off, out of the gate, the night we went there for dinner. I would have thought you couldn't miss it, but Ira gets indignant. How do you know all this? How do you know all these things? Because you're so smart, he says, or because I'm so dumb? Ira, I told him, There's a family of two living in that house, not a family of three. A family of two that has no concrete human relationships except each with the other. There's a family living in that house that can't find the right scale for anything. The mother in that house is being emotionally blackmailed by the daughter. You will not live happily as the protector of someone who is being emotionally blackmailed. Nothing is clearer in that household than the reversal of authority. Sylphid is the one wielding the whip. Nothing is clearer than that the daughter bears a rankling grudge against the mother. Nothing is clearer than that the daughter has got it in for the mother for some unpardonable crime. Nothing is clearer than how uncurbed the two of them are with their overwrought emotions. There is certainly no pleasure between those two. There will never be anything resembling a decent, modest state of accord between so frightened a mother and this unweaned child.